The imperfect is a very tricky verb form. It is used for the past tense, and it is very easy to form, quite unlike the preterite. But while the preterite seems to be easy for English speakers to use, the imperfect is very tricky. To say the least, we have nothing like this in English. And in fact, we rely on various constructions and adverbs to convey the same meaning. Forming the imperfect could not be easier. AR verbs use a variation of the suffix aba. So a verb like hablar is formed by the usual mechanics. Take off the AR and add in the appropriate endings to form. Yo hablaba, tú hablabas, él y usted hablaban, nosotros hablábamos, and ellos, ellas, ustedes hablan. ER and IR verbs both use ia. So verbs like comer and vivir would follow the same pattern. Take off the ER or IR and add in the appropriate endings. Yo comía, vivía. Tú comías, vivías. Él y usted comía, vivía. Nosotros comíamos, vivíamos. And ellos, ellas, ustedes comían, vivían. And here is the best part. There are exactly 3 verbs in Spanish that have irregular imperfect forms, and they are not that irregular. We have ser, ir, and ver. First, let's take a look at ver. Really, what we see is that the e in the infinitive is kept, and that's not that big an exception if you think about it. With both ser and ir, they actually take their forms from their Latin predecessors. Ser looks exactly like what Latin esse did, and ir looks exactly like what Latin ire did. In fact, all IRE verbs in Latin had imperfect endings that looked like this verb, and the B disappeared. This is why there is an accent mark on the ia forms. It comes from the B that disappeared. So, as you can see, even in Spanish, the irregular imperfect forms are easy to remember. As we learned earlier, while the forms of the imperfect are relatively easy to remember, the uses of this verb form can be difficult to recall for English speakers. Since we do not have a true imperfect form and rely on adverbial constructions to convey the same information, this area takes extra attention. So, to start off, we primarily use the imperfect in Spanish to describe repeated or habitual actions that happened in the past. These events did not just happen once. That would be preterite. Rather, you cannot pin them down at one time. There is a repetition about these actions. So, when we say, yo siempre hablaba por teléfono con mi amiga, we are implying that there is more than one time that I called my friend. I did it repeatedly and habitually. Notice that in English we say used to. This is one way that we convert the imperfect in English. We also use the imperfect to talk about 2 actions that occur at the same time, 2 parallel actions in the past. Usually in Spanish, this is set up by the word mientras, like in this sentence. Mientras ella cantaba, yo tocaba el piano. Notice the English phrasing, using the past progressive, was doing something. This is the other verb construction that we use in English to represent the same information as the imperfect does in Spanish. Overall, we use the imperfect to describe in the past, especially if the verb in question is being used to set up background information or to provide details that help to give body to the story. You can see that in this sentence. Ellos eran muy amables. Las montañas eran altas y hermosas. Because these are just generally describing and giving background information, we use the imperfect. Because we use the imperfect to describe background information in the past, we can include this in using the imperfect to tell time, age, or weather information while telling a story. If you think about it, this makes sense because these are all background details that help us to tell a story. However, they do not give the next event of the story. Finally, we use the imperfect to set background, ongoing action of a story that is about to be interrupted with the preterite. As mentioned, in English, we do not have anything like the imperfect as a verb form. There are a couple of constructions that we use that are similar. Used to do something, was doing something, but we primarily use adverbs in English to convey the aspect information that the imperfect does in Spanish. These are just some of the adverbs that can convey that information and tip us that we should use the imperfect in Spanish. In general, any adverb that implies repetition, generality, or habitual actions will usually require the imperfect in Spanish. Let's see the imperfect and a bit of the preterite in action. Take a look at this paragraph. Ayer fue un día horrible. Hacía mal tiempo y llovía y el viento soplaba. Mi hermano entró al apartamento y estaba completamente mojado. Lo que es más, estaba triste y deprimido. Mientras yo lavaba los platos, él me decía de su día espantoso. All of those imperfect verbs, hacía, llovía, soplaba, estaba, decía, do not progress the story much. They give detail, background information, but they do not tell you what happens next. That is the role of the imperfect in a nutshell. So, when we analyze what the imperfect does, we see that it obviously talks about the past, but it has a durative quality. It talks about actions that simply exist and not necessarily at a particular time. And for reasons that we'll talk about later, we know that this is indicative. Next step, how to use both the preterite and the imperfect together to tell a story.